Hey guys, my name is Kirk Veldman, and this is my mini lecture on Herodotus. So Herodotus was a Greek historian. He lived from about 484 to 425 BC, and he was from a town called Halicarnassus. Uh, so Halicarnassus is what's now known as the city of Bodrum in Turkey. And if you're looking at the Greek mainland and the Aegean Sea, you'll see the Peloponnesus where Sparta and Laconia are located. And if you go straight across the Aegean, you'll run right into Bodrum or where Halicarnassus was. So we don't know a ton about Herodotus. We do know a tiny bit. We know he was born into a wealthy family and likely they were influential in Halicarnassus. And at that time, it was his hometown was part of the Persian Empire, so he was a Persian subject. And they were also heavily influenced by Ionian Greek culture. And in that culture, rationalism was a huge thing, and this likely played into his curiosity about causes and origins um, of various things, most famously the Greco-Persian Wars. And so we see his birth in 484. So that means he was born just before Xerxes and his forces invaded Greece in Persia's second attempt to take over the Greek mainland. So he likely didn't remember it. I mean, I don't remember much from M4. I don't know about you guys, but if you think about your memories from then, you probably aren't remembering a ton. So um, that doesn't mean he couldn't speak to eyewitnesses about it, though. He definitely spoke to his parents' generation. He definitely spoke to people who saw the battles, who saw them happen. And he definitely heard from people who were at least contemporaries of various events going on in the Greco-Persian Wars. He also traveled quite a bit. So um, he could have gone as far as Egypt and Babylon. In fact, we're pretty sure he did go out there. And he certainly traveled through the Greek mainland, so all over Sparta to Athens, all in that area. Um, we're pretty sure he died up in Macedon, so in either Thurii or Pella. Thurii's even out in like out in Italy. Um, so he was all over the place, and his location, like I said, it's not certain, but he was probably about 59 or 60, which puts his death at the 425 BC number that I mentioned earlier. As for personality traits, so obviously to be a historian, he had to be intensely curious. Like I said, he wanted to know beginnings and endings of all sorts of things, Greco-Persian War most famously, but he looked for a bunch of other things as well. So he wanted to know where the Nile River began, for example, where the Greeks got their gods, and even how Darius came to rule Persia, all sorts of things like that. He was also interested in how the history of things commented on human nature. So, like, in this sense, he's similar to his contemporary, younger contemporary Thucydides, but we're not talking about Thucydides, but there is a similarity there. But he especially focused on power and how it corrupted people and got into their heads. So the Persians are, this is a theme for them throughout his whole entire work of history. Um, and then he goes further and points out individuals like Xerxes and Croesus, the king of Lydia, as being guilty of letting power get into their heads. So Xerxes, we know from the second Persian invasion, he at Thermopylae famously he looked at the Greek forces and realized, wow, there's only a few of them. I'm just going to run through the pass, no problem, and this will be over like that. And we know how that ended. The Persians got stood up by about 7,000 Greeks, despite their massive amount of people. And then he went even further, and we see at the Battle of Salamis, he once again thought, wow, this is going to be a free win. And he just got absolutely wiped out. Croesus, some of you might not have heard of, he was supposedly a fabulously wealthy king of Lydia. And in Herodotus's telling, he runs into Solon, and he asks Solon, who's the happiest man in the world? And he's expecting Solon to answer that he is, because of his amazing wealth and prestige and all that stuff. But as the story goes, Solon doesn't say that he's the happiest man in the world. In fact, he says some Athenian commoners who did some great deeds were happier than he was, and they were just common people. This kind of ticked Croesus off, but ultimately we see he learns his lesson because he gets completely just destroyed by Cyrus. And he's no longer fabulously wealthy, and he realizes that wealth isn't really the key to power and the key to happiness. And he's let down essentially. So yeah, Herodotus has a few of these things that just point out how power can corrupt the human mind and how it's not always a good thing, and you have to be very, very careful with it. Um, he was also open-minded. So a common misconception in the Greek world that at that time was that non-Greeks were just culturally inferior and that women had low intelligence as a rule. So for the first point, he does call the Persians barbarians in his histories all the way through. But it's just a word he uses to describe them. It has it's he tells stories that show a difference between the cultures and how both sides saw each other as somewhat outlandish and in some cases even horrifying. Um, so for an example of this, he talks about some Indians from Cilicia and regular Greeks from the mainland discussing funerary practices. So these Indians from Cilicia, which it's probably pretty horrifying for us to hear it, but they would eat the corpses of their parents when they died. So the Greeks, they didn't like that. They thought that was terrible. Like, so the story goes that Darius had them in his court. He looked at the Greeks and asked them, how much would it cost for you, or how much money would you need to eat your parents when they died? And the Greeks were like, no price. Like, that's just not going to happen. And so then he did the same thing to the Indians, and the Greeks back then burned their dead on funeral pyres. And so he looked at the Indians and he said, how much money would it take for you guys to burn your parents on a funeral pyre? And they were like, stop talking. That's terrible. Why would you ever do that? And so Herodotus is aiming basically to say, listen, both sides have different customs, different ideas of what's right. And just because you're Greek doesn't necessarily mean yours is correct. Um, and then he also talks about the women, like I mentioned. So a lot of stories in his histories also deal with the intelligence of various queens and just women in general. One of the most famously is Queen Artemisia, who's from his hometown, Halicarnassus, actually. He has a few stories in there about her cunning and wisdom. He also defended Egyptian culture, so they looked down on them as well. But he pointed out that they were more ancient than the Greeks were, and that the Greeks might have actually gotten their gods from Egypt. Um, yeah, so he definitely kept an open mind. He has a fair and balanced approach to his history that's not completely biased towards the Greeks. So there is some Greek bias. Obviously, he's a Greek. Uh, he participated in tried to overthrow his Persian overlords in his hometown. So he didn't like the Persians, but despite that, he does approach things with a more open mind and tries to be as unbiased as possible. Obviously, nobody can be perfectly unbiased; it's just humanly impossible. But he does try to limit it to a great degree. Moving on to some major accomplishments. So his biggest one, obviously, is his writing of the histories. So I've got it right here. It's his primary work. It's his lifelong project. And it covers the beginning of the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians, all the way back to Troy and the Trojan War. So, and his accounts in here, in this book, are some of the only ones that we have about the battles of Marathon and Thermopylae, among others. Um, and without his work, some of the most famous tales of Spartan bravery would likely be untold. So we think about the Battle of Thermopylae, Leonidas and his last stand, all of these things that somewhat made the Spartans famous and made them revered would be lost to antiquity without him writing about them and telling the story. So in terms of like legacy of his work, Herodotus obviously has an overwhelmingly positive legacy. I mean, he founded the first systematic approach to investigating history. Thucydides did improve it, and he was more accurate in his telling, but there isn't a doubt that Herodotus was the first. He was the first to have an inquiry-based historical approach to writing down what happened and how it happened and why it happened. And like I said, without Herodotus, much of what we know about the Greco-Persian Wars would be lost to antiquity. We just wouldn't know about them, and that's just it's tragic, really, if he didn't write about it. Furthermore, he also he contributed to anthropology as well. So our own textbook, actually, for this class, A Brief History of Ancient Greece, points out that some scholars have coined him not only the father of history, but the father of anthropology as well, because he didn't just study battles and he didn't just study the movements of soldiers and like what was going on at the time. He also he studied people groups, and he studied what people thought about different things and how people thought. And he was very well rounded as a student of his questions and as just somebody who wanted to know what was going on in the world and why. Um, so, despite some inaccuracies, his work has also been found to be accurate and true in lots of cases. So, based on historical and archaeological discoveries made over the thousands of years since he lived, we've realized that he did actually he actually pointed out quite a bit that is true, and that we can rely on his tellings of what happened. Maybe not numerically, maybe not exactly as it happened, but the base structure of what he's saying likely is true, because it's been backed up through the archaeological record, through historical records, etc. Obviously, there were some flaws with his work. He's not 100% accurate with his findings. So, for example, he says something like 5,300,000 Persians invaded Greece, and that's just not possible. Like, the Greek mainland can't even support that many troops moving through it. There's not enough fresh water, for one thing, and just moving that many people in battle is just ridiculous. It wouldn't have been possible. Some people have tried to rationalize the number by that's what it would have appeared to some Greek person just because the mass of the force. They were just throwing out a huge number because they'd never seen anything like it before. But regardless, we know that that number is likely not true. The most it could have been was probably 500, 600,000, and that includes support troops. That includes the wagons. That includes all that stuff. That's not his fighting force. And that's the top number. It probably wasn't even that big. He also includes some tall tales in his writings. So he mentions the Trojan horse and the Trojan War, and then he includes legends like Leonidas was descended from the Greek hero Heracles or Hercules, which sure he might if a Heracles did exist, Leonidas might have been descended from him, but probably not the demigod Hercules, because there is no such thing as demigods. So there is some embellishment, there is some stuff like that, but for the most part, we can rely on what he said and what he told us. So despite his flaws, Herodotus' work was the first of his kind. Some historians still, though, are uncomfortable with calling him the father of history. They prefer to give that title to Thucydides. But personally, I align with the many historians who do give the title to Herodotus, primarily because he was the first to approach history in a scientific inquiry-based manner. And then he weaved he then went to go on and weave his findings into a readable narrative. We were able to read it to this day. I've got a copy right in front of me. Thucydides he may have perfected the science of history. He was focusing on the facts of what happened, but Herodotus was the first to go about an inquiry-based method, and I think he deserves his place as the father of history. So his stated goal in the histories is to publish his research in the hope of thereby preserving from decay the remembrance of what men have done, and of preventing the great and wonderful actions of the Greeks and the barbarians from losing their due reward of glory. And I think he accomplished his goal, and he paved the way for historians to accomplish this goal about people and people groups all over the world to this day. So that's Herodotus. Thanks for watching.